Let me welcome you today to this fourth lesson of how to avoid life's pitfalls. Coming out of Genesis chapter 41, 28 through 32, 47 through 54. And today is the pitfalls of hard times. Now, we all have been impacted by this pandemic, shutdowns, job losses, rumors of war, all of the shortage of food and supplies. Now we see the impact of inflation, of paying more for food, gas, and the accessories of life that have a greater impact into people's everyday life. And many people can't afford just to pay their bills or put food on the table or buy gas for their vehicle. And so they're left with the choice to choose which one is the most important. But today I want you to know that God is bigger than the battles that we face in this life. He's bigger than the economy of the world's market. God knows exactly where we are. And you see that what we need in life, He knows that very need. And He's able to give us all of those things that we need when we seek out His will and His plan for our life. See, then He will add those things that is needed to our lives personally. See, today I can speak for myself. Personally, I have never had to beg for food or a place to lay my head at night, because God has always provided just exactly what I need each and every day. And see, each day the widow woman had to return to the barrel of meal and to the cruse of oil by faith. See, where she found just enough for that day. Likewise, we have to return by faith each day to receive our daily blessings. That's what He says in our Lord's Prayer. And so, the pitfalls of hard times we might not see in this life. We can't see in front of us far enough down the road to see and understand, but God can, and He can prepare and lead us to that perfect thing that God has for our life. And He did for Joseph in the midst of hard times, and that the people that was all around him was fixing to experience something that this hardship or this pitfalls of hard times. And today our situation may be different than what Joseph's and these Egyptians was facing at this time, but it will give us some key principles today that will help us in this story to be able to stand strong in faith in the midst of hard times. See, Joseph had found himself in Egypt because of his brothers had sold him to the traders of the Ishmaelites, and there Joseph had found himself in Egypt, where they sold him to Potiphar, the Egyptian officer, the captain of the guards, and Potiphar's wife had wrongly accused Joseph as he was a slave to Potiphar, saying that he was trying to have his way with her. And Potiphar had him thrown in prison. And see, there he had been given a chance to, in prison, he'd been given a chance to interpret two different dreams. One from the chief official of the butler and the baker. But see, when he interpreted, he understood what one of them was going to live. The butler was going to live. And so he asked him to do him a favor, to talk to Pharaoh for him when he received and got restored back to the butler position. But he waited for 2 years before he heard anything. And Joseph, he had to be patient to wait upon God as he held to his faith in God. See, his dreams, he was confident. He understood his dreams. He was confident that God would answer in God's time, not his time. And when we have a problem in life, we must turn to the only one in life who can help us, and that's God. God can help us in a time of need, in time of trouble. And so here we see verse 28 says, "This thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh, what God is about to do, He showed unto Pharaoh." See, God is watching us. He was watching Joseph's life to teach us to seek out God's wisdom. when we face hard times. It's when we trust Him enough that we seek His wisdom and we follow that, then we won't be left disappointed in our life. You see, when we see for ourselves that being wise will get us through the difficult times that we may face in this life. Remember, wise men sought out Jesus Christ. And when they found Him, they was not disappointed. No, but it allowed them to fall down and to worship God. And that's what we can do when we're wise, when we seek God's wisdom. See, knowing the butler would be restored to Pharaoh, Joseph asked him to do him a favor. Once Joseph had interpreted the dreams, the dream had come true within 3 days, just as Joseph had told him. But the butler forgot about him. See, Joseph had to wait 2 years until Pharaoh was troubled by a dream that had woken him out of his sleep. And then after he fell back to sleep, he had another dream. It was a similar dream to the very first dream. In the first dream, he dreamed of 7 puny cows devoured 7 healthy cows. The second dream was 7 thin ears of grain consumed the 7 plump ears of grain. This dream had haunted Pharaoh. He had asked the magicians to help him, and there was no help at all. See, they could not interpret his dream. Joseph had told the chief butler, and he told Pharaoh, that the interpretation belonged to God. See, the butler finally remembered Joseph. They cleaned Joseph up, and they brought him to Pharaoh. Now I want you to notice, Joseph, when he was confronted to Pharaoh, he did not, face to face, he did not mention his needs, his wants. Instead, he assured Pharaoh that God would be able to interpret his dream. And then after that, he explained what each dream meant. Egypt would enjoy 7 plentiful years, followed by 7 years of emptiness. Famine was coming. And once more, Joseph had painted a picture for Pharaoh that directed him to God, just like he did the butler and the baker. He opened the door to present God. But he also assured Pharaoh that God had a plan and that he would move Egypt along in keeping with his plan. See, God gave these dreams to Pharaoh to let him know what he was about to do with Egypt, with these 2 dreams. Now, he had given them insight in how the future would unfold. So look, the best the world had to offer Pharaoh to interpret his dreams had failed him. They had let him down. What the world has to offer me and you will fail us. The world will let us down. But listen, God understands. God knows. And see, the world cannot provide Pharaoh with the critical insights into the future, because God alone can give these interpretations. He gives these dreams, and it's that he needed God to lead Egypt successfully into the future. And we got to have God to lead us successfully into the future as well. We can't leave God out of the picture. And then we see in verse 29, it said, "Behold, there comes 7 years of plentiful throughout all the land of Egypt." Joseph had told him that God would bless them in the land of Egypt beyond measure. And with the 7 years of great harvest, it would produce great and plentiful throughout all the land. What is interesting, this Nile River would flow throughout Egypt each year, and it would overflow the land. And when the water would recede or it would go down, that rich topsoil from the flood would enrich the ground to make it a better for agriculture or for the animals. So for hundreds of miles along the river, the seeds planted in the rich soil gave them plenty of food and harvest. Not only gave them a great harvest, but plentiful. And as a result, the livestock would get the benefit, and not only the livestock, but the Egyptians would get a benefit from this. So according to the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, The next 7 years after the plentiful, the first 7 years were going to be beyond they can imagine. Not only that, in fact, the 7 years would be like never seen before in the land of Egypt. In verse 30, he says, and there shall rise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plentiful shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. Now, it's a continuation into the next verse, but we'll just cover this verse. Pharaoh could expect, excuse me, he could expect famine would follow those 7 years of plentiful. In fact, this famine would be effect right after the 7 good years. But the nation could continue to press on because the 7 good years would give them hope. Why? Because it would only last for 7 years. They had hope. They could see beyond that. But every year that this famine that passed, it would leave people in Egypt less hopeful. They would begin to get less hopeless and hopeless as each year would continue about the great years of harvest that they had experienced in the past. And eventually, the 7 positive years, the 7 great years shall be forgotten. The people would lose hope altogether as they watched this land that once produced more than enough food become empty, became a wasteland that provided nothing to eat. As they watched this land and their fields, they became barren. They would have nothing on their mind except their despair, sorrow, their hurt, because the land of Egypt and the land became famine. It became barren. This drought would consume the land, and it was going to overtake the nation of Egypt and beyond the nation of Egypt. Go to verse 31 now. And the plentiful shall not be known in the land by reason of the famine follow, for it shall be very grievous. Here again, Joseph told Pharaoh the Egyptians would not remember the 7 years of plentiful harvest because the next 7 years of famine took hold of their lives. So by repeating this warning about the nation's memory, Joseph underscored that Pharaoh that death would be on the doorsteps because this famine was going to be grievous. Hungry people would have a short memory. We know when times get tough, people have a short memory, and eventually they would be forgotten about the great blessing that once they had seen in the past 7 years. So their thoughts would be only on their needs to find something to eat. Just think about this. 2 years earlier, Joseph faded from the chief butler's memory. Likewise, the day of plenty, the days of plentiful would dim from the people's memory as they would face grievous years of the drought still to come. In verse 32, and for that dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God and will be shortly bring it to pass. There's 3 important insights in here. Pharaoh had only 2 dreams, but it really was the same dream, but it was doubled twice. Now, this source of his dream was that there is only one true God that could answer these dreams, and this revealed, third of all, this revealed what God was about to do. One dream given twice, it was established by God, and that God was certain to bring it to pass soon. See, as a young boy, Joseph had 2 dreams that is both similar. In both of his dreams, he had reigned over his father and his brothers. And that began to start soon after his dreams. And so now the butler and the baker had dreams while they was in prison, and both their dreams was similar, but yet some difference in their dreams. But it was shortly came to pass. Pharaoh had 2 quite similar dreams, but his dreams had a very significant outcome. Joseph had warned that having the same dream doubled unto Pharaoh twice, in which it verified with complete certain that God would make these dreams come true. Why? Because the thing is established by God. It was already part of God's plan for Egypt. And so it would definitely experience the 7 years of plentiful, of harvest, followed by the 7 years of desolations or famine, the troubles and drought that was going to come to them. See, Pharaoh had to make a wise decision to bring Joseph up out of prison, because having Joseph there, he had access to the wisdom of God. And even though Pharaoh had not recognized God at first, Joseph interpreted his dreams to show him the presence of God. So Joseph gave Pharaoh God's plan for Egypt that would shortly bring to pass. And Pharaoh had been given an opportunity to be able to get God's wisdom regarding the future for Egypt for the next 14 years. What's interesting, at this point, Joseph did not know his own position or his own life, what God had planned for him at this moment in time. But God was still working behind the scenes. So now we're going to skip down to verse 47. We're dropping several verses here. And it says in verse 47, and in the 7 plentiful years, the earth brought forth by handfuls. Today, when we seek out God's wisdom in a crisis or whatever our circumstances may be, that we can count on God to lead us in that right directions. Now, he might not show us the entire plan all at once. He may just give us little pieces at a time, just to show us enough to give us an insight to guide our steps one day at a time. Either way, it takes faith and it takes trust in God that he will direct our path. He says in Psalms 119, 105, the word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Now see, God will always guide us, and his word is a lamp. It will show us that God is faithful and that he can be trusted. See, that allows us to take those next steps of faith one step at a time by faith, because we can see that light of God. Now, I want you to notice, after Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, he laid out a plan of action. He advised Pharaoh to take advantage of these 7 good years of plentiful harvest by storing up enough grain for the next 7 grievous years that was soon to follow. See, Joseph offered his advice from God, not his own advice, but from God. And Pharaoh responded by appointing Joseph to a position of authority over Egypt that would guarantee the success of his plan that Joseph had received from God. We notice when Joseph was over Potiphar, his success belonged to God. And when he was over the prison, his success belonged to God, because without God, it would have been impossible for him to be able to carry out God's plan. So this guaranteed the success of God's plan. Now, Joseph's new position, it gave him complete control over the entire nation. Only Pharaoh himself had more authority than Joseph. And so Pharaoh had showed favor to Joseph, just as Potiphar did, and just as the prison guard had showed favor. Now, Joseph's advice included to appoint overseers over those who would be in charge of collecting the excess grain during the 7 years of plentiful harvest. And then he recommended a royal decree calling for 1/5. You see, God had gave him the numbers of what that it would take each year to be stored away, so that they could have those productive years of harvest as they unfolded. And Joseph found himself as a very busy man, because the Lord gave him more than ever before. In fact, the earth brought so much forth that it had by handfuls, that Hebrew word for handful. It paints as a picture of someone holding up fistfuls of grain. So in keeping with God's promise, he had provided much more grain for the Egyptians than the nation could even use. See, this was going to come in play later. In verse 48, he had gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities, the food of the fields, which was round about every city, he laid up in the same. So we see that Joseph had a responsibility for gathering excess grain throughout all the land of Egypt and to store it up for the next 7 years. Now, this would have been a very difficult task to follow, because this process of collecting food would have turned into a crisis if God had not been on the other side of his plan. Imagine trying to take food from someone, even if they've got a lot. People don't want to give up the things of life. See, Joseph had to follow the blueprint that God had gave him completely through that collecting process. Joseph done his job, just as he had managed Potiphar's affair, his estate, the prison. He had managed a prison as administrator. Joseph never lost sight of God's plan or God's business that was in front of him. As he moved throughout all the land, the details that related to the work, he followed every step of the way until he had completed the task of preparing Egypt for these 7 difficult years that laid in front of them. And see, Joseph showed trust in God's plan. He knew that it would work, because if he had not had faith and trust in it, it would have been a disaster. He could not carry out God's plan. So this was a very big and it was a difficult challenge that was set before him. It's not like before. See, God had already challenged him in tough situations before. So now this was even a bigger job, or a bigger task in front of him. So these 7 years of plentiful that was grown, he required them to establish supervision and organization that composed of workers of a wide variety of work skills here, from building, construction, transporting, harvest, and then to be able to account for all of the storage and to count all the grain that was to be brought in. And so what he had gathered from all the people to be supervised. This was a great administrative work that was in Joseph's life that he had to begin to work with. Now, those who worked under Joseph's leadership could carry out God's plan. See, Joseph had to have people underneath of him that he could trust as well. So, and to be able to follow his leadership. And so this was a very big job. This was not only just a big job, but this was a widespread. It was throughout the country. So that needed to be managed closely for the next 14 years. And we see that Joseph followed God's plan because he believed it came from God. See, but he had patience and trust and faith in the last 13 years of his life that allowed him to be able to complete and to follow God completely. That takes a lot of trust and faith when we step out and we do things for God that's out of the ordinary or something different in our life that we're not used to. It takes a lot of faith and trust to make those steps of faith. And so Joseph made those steps of faith, and so he demonstrated that he continued to follow God's plan regardless of the difficulty of who would go with us, or we must be faithful, or we must continue to work in God's plan. It takes a devotion to God, and this is what Joseph had to his plan. And I wanted to ask you today, are you devoted to God and his plan for your life? Joseph had to work constantly. He had to build storage buildings in the city throughout all the land of Egypt that was located near the fields from the food which would be gathered up together. He also chose cities based on their closeness to the field. Joseph had to manage many workers who would go in and go out and collect grain from each farmer. and all the food was covered by Pharaoh's decree. And then he had to manage those who took that food to the storage building. And then he had to account for it properly. So all of this was a very difficult job to do. But to be able to do this, Joseph had to manage and to store it, all this grain that was gathered in properly. All right, going to 49. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much until he left numbering, for it was without a number. And see, we hear Joseph had to continue to follow God's plan in gathering the grain. He come to a problem that he did not anticipate. This was the abundance of harvest that it came in. It was more than he expected. It proved to be too much for his accounting system. So he left off numbering, for it was without a number. See, then he shifted his attention to just storing all of this properly. Malachi 3:10 says, Bring ye all your tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will not open you a window of heaven and pour out a blessing that there is not to be room enough to receive it. See, God will bless us with more than we can count for or than we expect, because we see that we don't deserve many things in life, but God graced us and He has favored us and He's blessed us. So these 7 years of plentiful is described as the fulfillment of God's promise that He had gave to Abraham not long after He told him to go to the land of Canaan. He told his descendants that he would be like the stars in the skies, innumerable. Later He promised again that his descendants would be like the sand of the seashores. So counting this grain had taken in would have been impossible to count. It'd be like the grain of the sand of the seashore. This grain was immeasurable. It was a measurable amount of food that Joseph had gathered for the future. Verse 50, and unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of the famine began, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bare unto him. Look today, when everything is going good in our life and we're fruitful, we've been blessed, it's so easy to hold our hands up and to be proud and say, look what God has given us. But there are those fruitful days in our life, they will eventually end. They're coming to an end someday. And then it sets in that place of transition from being blessed to the drought of uncertainty, unexpected circumstances of life. It can create a terrible crisis in our life. And even for the very best Christians, it will take a toll on us. Joseph showed how that we can be fruitful even in the face of the most difficult times of our life. He had experienced and he had been trained to handle the most stressful situations. Joseph had collected as much food as was possible before the years of drought had set in. The first 7 years proved to be a success because he kept his focus on God's plan. So he wisely prepared Egypt for the future, for the next 7 years. But for the pitfalls of hard times, we have to prepare ourselves for the hard times that are ahead. See, God had given him the strength, the skills, the stamina, so he can complete this job at hand. Notice God also done something else for Joseph in his life. Look, he blessed him with a family that included 2 sons. When Joseph began his work collecting food, he was 30 years old. During the 7 years of plentiful, Asenath became his wife. She was a high social status. She belonged to the godless Neth. Her father, Potiphar, was an Egyptian priest who led the worship of Re, the god of the sun, the center of the solar worship in ancient Egypt, also known as Hippolytus. See, Pharaoh also called Joseph's name Zaphenath Pania, which is to be said, God said, let him live. What is interesting, God said, let him live. And so he gets a name that God let him live. And we see that God began to let him live. But instead of thrown in the pit by his brothers, he was to live. Instead of going into prison and to die, he was to live. And God continued to work to let him live in his life. And see, Joseph, words and action through those years that he proved that he did not compromise his walk with God. Even though he never worshiped idols, as his father-in-law has served as a priest of false gods, so he never worshiped those idols. In 51, and Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh, for God said, he made me forget all of my tools and all of my father's house. God had truly blessed Joseph, and he became fruitful because God was with him, and now God was rewarding him with what he had lost, his family. God had given him a family of his own. So Joseph called his firstborn son Manasseh, and it reflects that God had helped Joseph to forget all of my toils, troubles, pain, sorrow, and even my father's house. See, for Joseph to move forward in his walk with God, he needed to put the past behind him so that he can move on with his life. So he had reflected on his past. It was extreme hurt, trouble, and sorrow, slavery, prison, lies, and his people lied on him. So a life filled with heartaches and headaches, and this pain that was in his heart did not start when they sold to the traders of the Ishmaelites. No, you could trace this back to his brothers, his home place, where it all started, because he was favored by his father, and his hatred towards his brother, or his brothers had hatred towards him. They sold him to the traders, the Ishmaelites, who just happened to be passing by through Egypt. See, Joseph had been heartbroken, but thankfully today, God was going to heal his heart. How was he going to heal his heart? By giving him a son. And he did that. He gave him a son to take that pain away, and that pain faded through time. And Manasseh reminded him how God had enabled him to let go of the past and to move into the future. 52, and it says, and the name of the second called he Ephraim, for God caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Here, the second son is called Ephraim. Ephraim's name, it confesses that God had made Joseph fruitful in the land that he had been treated as a slave, been a despised felon, lost his respect. So Ephraim came to remind him of the present as well as the future. So now he had been released from his pain and sorrow of the past. Now he could see his life as something positive now that he had earned Pharaoh's respect and trust. He also was able to lead the Egyptians effectively to prepare them for the difficult years that laid in front of them. So after he completed a historical task in his life for the Egyptians, now he could enjoy the satisfaction that come with a job well done. But we can't stop there. When we've got a job and we completed the job, our job continues on. There's something else that we can do. See, God had told Joseph, from enduring the unspeakable afflictions of experience, to a indescribable fulfillment in his life that came with his success by leading the Egyptians to raising two sons. Look, every step of the way, God prepared Joseph well enough for him to be faithful in his work, and all that Joseph had to endure helped him shape and mold his life into a kind of leader that was needed to be able to accomplish the works of God. So that's what God wants in our lives. He wants to mold and make us and shape us into a life that we can be something that God can use, a vessel and a tool for God. 53, the 7 years of plentiful that was in the land of Egypt were ended. See, this door of opportunity for Joseph to be fruitful did not close after the 7 years of plentiful had passed. In fact, he could now guide and lead Egypt into the future through the next 7 difficult years of emptiness that would be more difficult than gathering all the food. Now, this was going to be a stressful part of Pharaoh's dream because it had hard and terrible times. Pitfalls of hard times was to follow these 7 great years. And so In due time, the drought it would cover all of Egypt, but it did not stop at the borders of Egypt. See, to make crisis even worse and more critical, this drought turned out to be more widespread than just the land of Egypt. And this led to a food shortage everywhere. And this was a time when there was there was a time in Canaan, when Abraham got to Canaan, there was a famine in the land. And Abraham had to go down into Egypt to be able to have food and grain for his family and all that was with him. So this is another of those times. This is the second time we see that this has happened. And now we go to verse 54, and he says, "And the 7 years of dirt began to come according as Joseph had said, and the dirt was in all the land, but in all the land of Egypt there was food." This famine had begun. It reached Egypt as soon as the people in all the land, they began to search for food when it hit their place. They was looking for something to eat because they did not have the amount of resources available to them. They did not prepare themselves to store enough food to last. And Joseph's leadership in Egypt alone allowed them to have bread in Egypt. During those years of plenty, Joseph had followed the plan of God and not his own. So the Egyptians, as well as the surrounding people and countries, could be able to endure this terrible and hard time, these difficult years. 7 years of it was going to follow. So this famine and drought brought an international crisis that gave Joseph the opportunity to be productive once again. So he took the responsibility of distributing the grain that had gathered, that he had stored up in Egypt, in the cities. And see in Genesis 41:56, it says the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened up the storehouse and sold unto the Egyptians all the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. See, this was causing emotional distress. This was difficult to bear, which brought hardship. This was hurtful to people. Pharaoh had given Joseph complete authority over all the food and how it was to be distributed out in the process to be able to feed these hungry people wherever they came from for grain. And so today, while we resist the hard times and those moments, it will help us grow spiritually in our lives. They are something that we can hold on to in our life when time of trouble, testing, the pitfalls of hard times may come. It will take patience on our part so that we can see God is still at work. He will bring us out. He will bring us out of the fire without a smell of smoke. Only the ropes that have us bound down that will fade away in our life, but God won't fade away, so that we can rejoice in the Lord. Look, when we follow God's plan, He will not leave us disappointed. And when we stay focused on God and we seek out His wisdom in our lives, then we will find praise, honor, and glory. And as we lift up our hands and we say thank you for all that you have done, for the wonderful blessings in our life, because God will never let His people down. He will never forsake His people. And we will never be disappointed when God is at work in our lives. God bless you today. Thank you.